higher, because they were resisting a wrong that was a massive burden. And by walking for more than a year, they took upon their lives a new sense of purpose and dignity, and a new sense of personal power. So, those three things, which I hope Jeff does clarify some of the...
It helps a lot, thank you.
Yeah, all right. Now, the United States has a very bad history of strikes because we've had such, and I use the term, we've had the kind of economic life, and I tend to use the term plantation capitalism. And I mean a whole lot of things by that. I don't mean just one thing. I don't like the term greed because it doesn't fill it. Greed is, in the classic Christian tradition, a sin, one of the 7 classic sins. So it's a personal attitude on the part of a person. But plantation capitalism has helped me to understand better what we're dealing with. Especially when plantation capitalism claimed for 250 years, and then again for another 130 years under Jim Crow law, that black people were not people. They were property. Therefore, they could be treated in any way that the plantation owner decided to treat them. That's why James Mason called plantation owners, in the Constitutional Convention debates, he called plantation owners, every plantation owner, he said, is a petty tyrant. Because the plantation owner had a whole range of people that he called wealth, that he called property, that he said had no right to learn to read, had no right to marry, had no right to their own body, to the control of their own bodies. All sorts of stuff that diminished. So in nonviolent language, there is such a thing as violence of the mind, violence of the attitude, which has to be eliminated and transformed. So another term that the sociologists have put up on this is what they call structural violence, systemic violence. Those are 2 words that they write about. Racism is systemic violence. Sexism is systemic violence, structural violence. I hope that is fairly clear. When women make only 70-some% of the dollar that the male worker makes, that's systemic violence. When black people and Mexican Americans and Asians make only a certain percentage of the dollar for comparable work on the job, that's systemic violence, you see. That's built into the structure. Most of the poverty in the United States is structural violence. We've built it into our economic life. We took the land from the Native American, from the Indian. We conquered the land. We took the land by various devices. We reduced 10 or 15 million Indians who were on these shores in this continental United States. We reduced them in less than 200 years to less than about 300,000 people. Our history books, and I remember this very well in high school, our history books say that the land wasn't settled. It was just a few thousand people. And that they didn't need all the land. But of course the anthropologists and the social scientists of the 20th century have gone back and tried to correct that. So they claimed 13 to 15 million people only in the United States area when the first settlers began to arrive. And by the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, there were less than 300,000 of them, all of them forced into reservations. And you may or may not know that those reservations are the most impoverished places in the United States even today. They have the highest levels of disease, the highest unemployment, underemployment levels, bad housing levels, bad environmental conditions, highest levels of pollution in those reservations where the Indian today largely lives. Still very angry about this in South Dakota, North Dakota, northern Michigan, and other parts of the United States where there's an Indian population. See? So that's structural violence. We reduced their lives to 21st century poverty. Racism is the same way. We black people experience the highest levels of underemployment and unemployment in the United States because of racism. Until 1964, all kinds of jobs were inaccessible, prohibited. You could not get that job, no matter how highly qualified you were. If you go back and take a look at universities in the United States and California, you see that almost every university in the 60s and 70s, because of the Civil Rights Bill of 64, had problems where the old boys clubs in chemistry or English or history said there are no PhDs, black PhDs that we know of. There are no women who have a PhD in English. So we can't hire them because they're not qualified. They're not there. I don't know if any of you know the story of what Robert Kennedy did when he became Attorney General, discovered that there were no black attorneys in the entirety of the Justice Department. And his immediate aides kept saying that we can't find any. And Robert Kennedy was a pretty wise and creative man. And he told them finally to write the 10 best law schools in the country and ask them for the names of the black graduates of the last decade. And the Justice Department, and then he said we should recruit them. So the Justice Department got literally hundreds of names of black lawyers just from those 10 law schools, and immediately put together the finest civil rights, human rights department, one of the finest such departments in the world. That's all been eliminated since the 60s by both political parties basically have eliminated men, women, Asian, Hispanic, black lawyers who could help them work on the litigation that is necessary to make our country far more accessible for far more people. All right, are there other questions or comments? Because I'm going to move on, try to present a body of material.
It sounds like you haven't ruled out, or nonviolence doesn't rule out coercion as a strategy.
Well, if you want to make coercion a dirty word, that's okay, but I don't make it a dirty word. Let's take this Nashville story. Let's divide it up. Let's say that this is the power grid of Nashville. And let's say that it's a grid that shapes how decisions were being made in Nashville by various entities. This could have been the Chamber of Commerce. Let's say this is the retail stores. Let's say that this is politics and the mayor. Media. Just as an example, you can do your own kind of a grid. In this power mix, as power decisions are being made, as decisions are being made, These operate in conjunction with each other. But the issue of racism and segregation is outside that grid, because they do not exercise their power seeing the 23 or 24% of the black community that is denied access at a great number of levels. So what our movement did was create a new piece of power. Through the nonviolent strategy, we began to demonstrate there is human need that also needs to be corrected, that we do not see. The dramatization of the sit-in helped to dramatize that issue. Fundamentally, the economic boycott, the picket lines, the mass meetings, all contributed to create a dimension of power that was aimed at correcting the things in this community that need to be corrected. Does that make sense? So it does take power, and that power can be used creatively by the confidence of the people, and it can be power then that moves, for one thing, power moved the merchants and a great variety of people to want to negotiate change. All right, yes, Jeff?
When you talk about this external seat of power, was their goal to become part of the power grid, or to remain external but influence the power grid?
Another excellent question. Because I have to say to you that while I talked about power, I didn't understand that this is the way it worked in the Nashville scene until afterwards. But in the movement, some people did want to become a part of the power structure. There's no doubt about that. And in 1960, we saw, let's see, 60, this, in 1960, 61, the Kennedy administration and the Democratic Party sought to absorb some of that power and manage it through the Democratic Party, as an example. So the movement itself did have difficulties, therefore, because some of us said we must help people empower themselves and let them shape how they're going to use it in their communities. And that should not be shaped by the rest of us. But other people said, we want to move into the power structure, so and did so. So it becomes a varied picture. Yes, sir.
The name and author of the book that analyzes nonviolent strategies 198 ways?
Yes, Gene Sharp, and that book is called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. All right, by Gene Sharp. And then let me put this other one here, A Force More Powerful. Which are Gandhi's words, incidentally. And this book is by Ackerman and Duvall. D-U-V-A-L-L. Okay. All right, we're going to move on then. Yes.
Just one more quick question. Maybe it's more of an observation.
Mm-hmm.
If, in fact, the Democrats under Kennedy began to try and absorb some of the power and force of coercion that was coming from the outside, can you then look at the whole episode of Fannie Lou Hamer and the alternate Democratic things as the Democratic Party shutting out that source of power? Because it seems to me that when they revised the whole thing with the people's movement that she represented, that was kind of like a closing of the door to that people power.
Well, it was the way in which Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party tried to absorb, without completely alienating, the all-white Democratic Party of the state of Mississippi. And I'll say to you personally, I was not in favor of that strategy. I supported it, but I felt that strategically it wasn't the best strategy for the movement. In 1960, the Kennedy administration tried to push the whole movement to go from the streets to registering voters as the main effect. But you see, the fact that in the last presidential election, the black community had the highest percentage of eligible voters voting in the country has not helped to reshape or have an impact upon the political issues. We still have double-digit unemployment levels across the country. Double-digit, that's one of the places where it's very active. I want to then try to quickly move into a second piece of intervention. Nonviolence works in several ways. The first benefit of nonviolence is the benefit of personal transformation and change or empowerment. That's very important. Gandhi said that nonviolence was the power that heals, and it wounds and heals. It's a double-edged sword, but that people who use it themselves begin to have a great recognition of their humanity and of their capacity for life. And so that's it's a transforming thing on those of us who use it. You get transformed and transformed and transformed and transformed. And you discover the unimaginable, in many ways you discover the unimaginable potential for life in yourself, for compassion and care, for neighborliness in yourself, for justice. You also then, nonviolence then says also that you must use it for your immediate family, because you need to build a community base, and that begins with your family. Base where there is forgiveness and compassion and empathy, and where you work from the stance of care rather than from the stance of management and control and domination. It's important for that development to take place. Then the third advancement of nonviolence is strategically into your neighborhood, to join with your neighbors in ways that can make a difference for the kind of neighborhood you have. And one of the reasons I agreed to be here today is the fact that in this Orange County you have huge amounts of fear because of the continuing harassment and intimidation of our Muslim sisters and brothers all across the board. I have not studied that, so I do not know what it is. I can guess some things, but I don't know if the Islamic community or the mosque in Orange County have come together in a kind of a fact-finding way to do a serious assessment of what that harassment, injury is about and what the fear that it causes is like. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But because I think that fear, that intimidation, that it will go away in time, perhaps, though the larger society is not encouraging the dissipation of religious bigotry, which is a kind of an astonishing story in itself from my perspective. It has not vanquished anti-Semitism, which has been, of course, the great bane of Christianity across 2,013 years, or 2,200 years. So that religious bigotry is not being dissolved or abolished or replaced, not just simply with tolerance, but replaced with the sense that we are, as we are a people in this country in the same boat. We belong to the same nation and all. Now, in all of these three steps or divisions that I've listed, the person, the family, the larger neighborhood, there is a major form of nonviolent action that every single person can play. And that's what I've come to call as the one-on-one or the face-to-face action. And if there's anything where we in the religious world, in the world of peacemakers, where we have failed, it's on this one-on-one, face-to-face tactic of helping people move from where they are to where they can be. So that's a tactic or a weapon that each one of us can use. We can't use it all the time, but here's the way I sort of frame that activity. That each person who's wanting a better society should have in their minds, in their hearts, maybe on a piece of paper, on a card, in their wallet, the name of an acquaintance, an encounter with somebody on the job or in the city or the area where you live, the name of a person who takes on some negative features of life that handicap our community in becoming a beloved community, ridding itself of anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic, racial, gender fear, and the rest of it. One-on-one, face-to-face. And that doesn't represent a imperialistic approach. I mean, now by this. Now, fundamentalist Christians like to ask people the question, are you saved? Or have you accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? I happen, as a pastor of some 45 years of work, to think that's the wrong question. Entirely. Because it seems to me that